flight controller, coming up on auto sequence booster. How do you? Where go flight? Go flight. Go flight. Go flight. Control. Network. Got it out. Got it all.
Just 60 years after the Wright brothers put man in the air, scientists and engineers were grappling with the next major challenge, putting a man in space and keeping him alive there. As an engineering challenge, it was the most extreme imaginable. Their solution? A rocket and the most complicated piece of personal protection equipment man has ever known, the spacesuit. For the American side of the space race, the design challenge was handed to a small team inside NASA, Crew Systems. The leader of their team was Matthew Radnofsky, the Mad Russian, an eccentric, second-generation Jewish immigrant with a can-do attitude and a broad Boston accent. He was also my grandfather. I barely knew him. He died when I was just 3 years old. Apollo 11 was his triumph.
One small step for man.
And the perfectly designed spacesuits the men flew in were his legacy. I've always been fascinated by space, and I've often wondered how he did it. For me, the story of the space race isn't just about the men who risked their lives to travel into the unknown, but the ones who held those lives in their hands. I grew up in Hertfordshire, England, a world away from America and the space race. I'm at my parents' house to ask my dad what he remembers about Grandpa. Looking at our old photographs and watching a NASA film, I realize how little I really know about my grandfather.
Your grandfather and his colleagues worked on the spacesuits. They designed the spacesuits that became the centerpiece of what the astronauts wore in the Mercury, Gemini, and the Apollo program that Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and all of the astronauts who followed them who walked on the moon.
I never really quite realised that, actually. I always thought that, he was just a very small part in this big machine, and actually I realise now he was actually quite a big part in a big machine.
I think he and a lot of people were big parts in that machine. I think there were a lot of people who took the goals that were given them, and they just went out and achieved it.
What did he say when we were born? Was he, because I don't remember him at all, was he a nice grandpa?
Yeah.
He clearly got along
Yeah,
with
you
didn't
didn't see a lot of him because he lived in Texas and we were here already by the time you were born.
Was he pleased
This
to
is
have grandkids?
Probably, oh yeah, he loved all of you and liked to talk about it.
What does it feel like now to talking about all this then? With all the pictures and me getting unaccountably emotional?
No, it feels great. It's really interesting to reevaluate a little bit and to remember the terrific person that your grandfather was, that my dad was. He was a real character, and I think about him a lot. I always have. And it's interesting when your parents have been gone for a while, you know, what do you think about? They're still there in your ear, and you can hear them.
What do you think about this?
What do I think about this?
What do you think about how fancy I am now doing a film?
Wow, this is great. I think it's a chance for you to discover who your grandfather was, and it's for you to get to know my dad in a way that maybe this is a start. I mean, we have a few pictures. You know, you're going to go off and talk to people who knew him and worked with him, and I think that's just terrific. I'm really glad.
My grandfather's fascination with safety clothing, and subsequently spacesuits, began during World War II. Matt Radnofsky was stationed at Thurleigh, Bedfordshire, in England, in the 306 Bombardment Group as a navigator in the B-17 Flying Fortress. All that's left now is a small museum operated by Ralph Franklin on the outskirts of the old airfield. I've come here with my dad because we both want to hear my grandfather's combat story. I think that some of the equipment used in the US Air Force at that time may have influenced Grandpa when he subsequently designed the astronauts' clothing and equipment. Ralph has a good collection of that old Air Force equipment here. During his time at NASA, Grandpa designed the astronaut's communications helmet, affectionately known as the Snoopy cap. It's easy to see how the influence for that came from the aviator's flying helmet.
They always had a hat like this. Mainly when you were flying, it was easier to have the headset, the earpiece, in the helmet, so it was all a complete fixture, and that was what they often wore.
Apparently, when Grandpa was working on the Gemini project, the astronauts kept complaining that their comms devices kept slipping. And so Grandpa said to somebody, oh, just get an aviator's cap and they can wear that underneath their helmet and that will keep the comms device in place. Maybe we attach that device to the hat. And I hadn't really realised that it was so literally exactly like that. Like, he wasn't just like, oh, let's get this hat that I remember from the war and see if we can put it together. He literally was like, oh, we'll just do what I did during the war. That makes sense. And so that's really cool.
Ralph also shows me a heated suit that the aviators wore to keep warm when they flew at high altitude.
Right, well, this is a heated suit, commonly known as the Blue Bunny, obviously because it's blue, I suppose. Why bunny, I don't know. You can see it with all the heating elements running through it.
I'm surprised how much it looks like something worn by NASA astronauts.
This looks just like a cooling suit that you wear underneath your spacesuit. So you say, okay, how are we going to manage to keep the astronauts cool when they're wearing this massive suit that weighs, more than 2 men? You just put them in a suit that has water running through it. And so again, like with the Snoopy cap, you can see really clearly that this is something that he would have been not even inspired by. It's such an obvious answer to a problem.
During the war, Grandpa was a navigator in a B-17 called the Casa de Umbriago, but I've never been able to picture him in action.
So this is really interesting because this is actually the inside of a B-17, this picture here, and it's really, I like it because it's the first chance I've had to understand what it would have looked like inside one. So where's the pilot in all this?
He's back here.
Okay.
This is where that is. We're looking from the back here down to the front.
What kind of temperatures would have actually been inside the aircraft to mean that you'd have to wear your jacket like that?
Well, this is where the heated suits came in and fur-lined jackets, because the American bombing was done from greater heights. That was the idea of it.
Dad asks Ralph if there's any record of when Grandpa was shot down in 1943.
This is called First Over Germany, and you may find your dad in here.
And Matthew Radnofsky, page 289. On November 21st, Lieutenant Edwin Schernbachler and crew in Casa de Umbriago were knocked out of formation when 2 rounds of flak hit under the nose.
Well, we hit, once you fall back out of formation, you're an easy target. We had to fall back out of formation because they had hit an engine. And when they hit an engine, there was an inboard engine, and it hit me.
Wounding First Lieutenant Matthew Radnofsky, the navigator. There we are.
And
there we are.
The tail gunner bailed out. Everybody bailed out. All the enlisted men bailed out. The pilot and the co-pilot stayed, holding the plane level. I was hit in the plane.
And these same explosions also set the number 2 engine on fire, severed the throttle linkage to number 1 engine.
The airplane lost 2 engines ultimately, and the 3rd engine finally. I got a great big piece of flak that went into my back, right through the armored suit that I was wearing. I had 2 armored suits, one that I laid on the floor and another one that I was sitting in, wearing, but I went right through it. Didn't make any difference.
Then another burst hit on the right side of this 423rd plane, and 2nd Lieutenant Marvin E. Traver, co-pilot, was badly wounded in his right leg. Wow, they were having a very bad day.
That was a bad day.
And laid me out flat. I was laying there, and it opened my parachute. My parachute was laying there inside. So the bombardier gave me his parachute and attached me to a static line right next to me and threw me out.
And other members of the crew who bailed out were First Lieutenant Douglas McKnight, who received a medal for saving my dad, getting him out.
Yeah.
He was the bombardier, and Sam Pugliese, ball turret gunner.
It came down from a very high altitude because it deployed very quickly, and it took a long time to get down. But it was wonderful. It was so quiet. And then I heard a dog barking, and I heard a bell ringing from a church. And then I landed in the trees, and it was the most wonderful landing you could ever get. I landed, and the parachute kind of landed over the top of the trees, and I plunged down, never hit the ground, just a couple feet from the ground, hanging there. I had a British parachute on, which was, you just turn a thing and hit it, and you fall out of it. And I was pretty much paralyzed due to my wounds. I was hit apparently by machine gun bullets while I was in the air, because I got 3 machine gun bullets in addition in me. When I parachuted, my boots fell off, my vest fell off, my escape kit fell off. Everything, the only thing that worked was the parachute, thank God. But nothing worked. That's how I became interested in working with safety equipment. Nothing worked.
Wow.
Well, I'm glad I thought of the book.
No, it's terrific to get this
You made a wonderful job
information.
of reading it out.
Makes me feel humble. When I was 19 years old, I wasn't doing anything like this.
In the United States, the Collings Foundation has offered me the chance to put myself in Grandpa's boots and take my own ride in a B-17. Despite my fear of heights, it's an unmissable opportunity. Climbing up into the B-17, I'm surprised how cramped it is.
Oh my God, it's really narrow and small.
It may look imposing from the outside, but it's actually crowded and very functional on the inside. For the first time, I get to see what the painting in the museum is like in real life. I can see the bombardier's position and the navigator's table where my grandfather would have sat and where he was injured.
I'm sitting here where the radio operator would have sat, and up there you've got where the pilots and the co-pilots would have been. And pretty great because you can actually, this is open up here, and it goes at, I think, over 100 miles an hour. So, oh, here we go, oh, here we go, oh, this is, oh, okay. Okay. Fine, no big deal, no big deal, no big deal.
It's a windy day, and after the flight, I'm told this has made our trip unusually bumpy, similar to how dodging flak during the war would have felt.
So glad that's over. It was really cool, but I feel really sick. Not like, I'm not going to throw up, just so everyone knows, but I feel sick.
Grandpa's experience of being shot down inspired his passion for safety clothing and ultimately led to a career at NASA. On October the 4th, 1957, Russia successfully launched Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite. This act marked the start of the space race, a battle for supremacy of space between the US and Russia. America responded with the Mercury project, making Alan Shepard the first American in space in 1961, followed by John Glenn less than a year later. In 1962, President John F. Kennedy declared the country would go one step further by putting a man on the moon and returning him safely, and all by the end of the decade.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Kennedy's famous rallying call to beat Russia to the moon galvanized thousands of American engineers into developing new technologies, including the spacesuit. The Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. is the perfect place to get the bigger picture of how the spacesuit was developed.
These basic spacesuits, the ones that Gagarin and Glenn wore, basically had the same function. They were there to keep air in case of emergency, to keep particles out, and to protect against any sort of radiation at those high levels of altitude. Spacesuits are not very comfortable things to wear. They're heavy, they're awkward, they're bulky, they're constraining, and getting everything right for the astronaut is very important.
So you've heard of my grandfather?
Yes, yes. I've seen his signature on documents and materials. Yes, he's very well known.
I think for me it's hard sometimes to understand exactly how he fit into everything.
The process of designing the suit is enormously iterative. It starts out with proposed suit designs and prototype suits that come from private corporations as a bid for a contract with NASA. And they work with NASA and the Crew Systems Division and the astronauts to decide what's good, what's bad, what has to be fixed, and what has to be modified. So there is an ongoing discussion. They have to have a suit that doesn't cost an enormous amount of money, that satisfies the astronauts because they're going to be the ones working in it, and that also meets the requirements to fit in the spacecraft, to work on it operationally, and fits the requirements of NASA and the Crew Systems Division.
So it sounds like also Grandpa would have then actually known a lot of different people if he was mediating between the astronauts, within NASA itself, within the contractors.
Yes, the contractor, he's known among the astronauts, he's known among contractors, and certainly at NASA. He's very famous, and he has his signature and signing off on materials and designs.
That's just crazy. I love
Yes.
that. It's incredible to hear someone say he was famous. I can't believe that. It's just, yeah,
Oh.
wow.
So everything your parents told you was true.
It's incredible.
One story they did tell me unites astronauts, engineers, and contractors alike. A disaster that could have ended the entire space program. On January 27th, 1967, the crew of Apollo 1, Roger Chaffee, Gus Grissom, and Ed White, were carrying out a routine test called the Plugs Out test, a kind of dress rehearsal for launch, when it went disastrously wrong.
Now we gotta get to the moon if we can't fly between 2 or 3 buildings.
Everything was going to plan, when suddenly, the control room heard one of the crew shouting over the intercom that there was a fire in the capsule. Some wire had sparked, and in the pure oxygen environment, it caused a fireball. The 3 astronauts were dead within 90 seconds. Walter Cunningham, lunar module pilot of Apollo 7, was also a member of the backup crew for Apollo 1. He had been in the same spacecraft just the night before, taking part in a similar test to the prime crew.
It was a real shock because we had done the test the night before, almost the same test, and we were waiting the next day for Gus, Ed, and Roger to form it with the plugs out and the hatch closed. So we were all going to fly back together, and by late afternoon there had been so many delays and little problems in the spacecraft that we finally decided that at about 5 o'clock we were going to take off. We flew back by ourselves, Wally, Don, and I. The shock we had was when we landed back here at Ellington Air Force Base, and usually we would just walk in, change leave our helmets and drive home, but there was the operations officer was there meeting us. We knew there was something wrong, went inside, and he told us about the fire and that the crew had died. So it was a shock to us, and so we immediately started trying to find out what had happened, and of course, going by, seeing the surviving spouses and doing what you do after a friend gets killed like that.
Gus Grissom and Roger Chaffee were buried at Arlington National Cemetery, the resting place of the nation's heroes. Ed White's family buried him at West Point Military Academy in New York.
I think it's very moving to come face to face with their real graves because it makes them more real, obviously, to see their names and just to see them among all the other graves of military men. These men died for their country in a way that I think they never expected to die, and I think that's what's also so hard. They died on the ground on a daily test that no one expected to be fatal, and I think that's probably what was hard for their families, is that they died in the development stages. They didn't die in space. It was just what considered to be a mundane Friday.
The space program was suspended for 18 months, while a major investigation looked into just what had gone wrong and advised changes to be made. Among them, the hatch to the capsule was redesigned to make emergency escape much easier, and the air inside it was changed to a less flammable mix of nitrogen and oxygen. The new challenge for Grandpa and the crew systems team would be to make the whole command module fireproof, and crucially, the spacesuit was specifically redesigned to be made from non-flammable material. The fire was a turning point in the space program. It brought about the realization that not just the most obviously dangerous scenarios needed caution, even a routine test on the launch pad could be fatal. After the investigation into the fire closed, all eyes were on what new fireproof suit the Apollo astronauts would wear, and who would create it. My grandfather, Matthew Radnofsky, was well known for working with the contractors who competed for the chance to design and build the new Apollo spacesuit. One company, ILC Dover, went to great lengths with a publicity stunt that showed their suit playing American football and winning the NASA contract by a touchdown. Nicholas de Monchaux has extensively researched the development of the suit in his book, Spacesuit: Fashioning Apollo. He tells me that in the early 60s, ILC Dover was a comparatively small company, best known for making women's underwear under the brand name Playtex.
Even at the time, people in NASA called Playtex, not ILC, partially as a kind of like we would call it, call someone by their nickname, partly as a kind of like, can you believe we're dealing with Playtex here?
Despite the company's lack of experience making protective clothing, their flexible and highly intricate design made it a clear winner. And incredibly, after they won the NASA contract, skilled seamstresses who had previously been sewing bras and girdles were moved to the painstaking job of assembling the Apollo's spacesuit.
Because the suit ended up being put together out of 21 layers of fabric, and not like 21 layers of fabric just cut out like a sandwich and sewn together, but actually 21 different suits put one inside of the other like a Russian doll, and then sewn to a 64th of an inch tolerance without any pins, because the pins might puncture the pressure layer. This was a kind of Herculean or Olympic feat of sewing, and to find people who could do it, they looked to the sewers, they were called, that they already employed, who are of course on the bra and girdle side, even though it was like two sides of the same warehouse. And then these women were the ones who put the suits together and actually figured it out. And there were no drawings of the suits. There was no kind of schematic drawing that told you how to put it together. The knowledge was really only in the fingertips of these women.
Nicholas says that during the research for his book, my grandfather's name came up often.
How often did his name come up? Was it something that was Matt Radnofsky something that seemed to be very instrumental?
Yeah, because in fact the particular role that my reading of all these documents is that there are two kind of people in any organization. There are the people who follow the rules, and there are people who get things done and allow the rules to be mostly followed. And I think that your grandfather seems to me to have been definitely in the latter camp. I mean, he was in this, the conflict and the egos around this were, planetary scaled. You had the most public geopolitical event of the late 1960s. You had all of national prestige on the line. Nobody wanted to be the person to screw it up. My impression is that he was an absolute pain in the ass when he needed to be, and that he was charming when he needed to be. And as I say, in these situations, you need these ringmaster figures who are able to channel and shepherd the energies of organizations to produce productive results. And your grandfather definitely seems like one of the most important ones when it came to all the things which actually kept astronauts alive, which in many ways were the most important things of all.
Many of my heroes from the Apollo program are no longer with us, so finding people who can tell me what it was like to design the suit that man wore to walk on the moon isn't easy. But former ILC engineer John Scheibel still has an extraordinarily bright mind and a passion for engineering. He's kept a moon boot that he liberated from ILC when he retired, and it's amazing to come face to face with such an iconic object.
This is exactly what you guys designed and what was used by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to walk on the moon.
This is the Apollo boot, and you've all seen this in various pictures of the footprint on the moon.
When it came to the big moment in Apollo, I'm talking about obviously the moon landing when I guess that was the real test, wasn't it? The EVA in Apollo 11 of the suit that you guys had designed.
Every one of our employees was in the plant and watched the landing on the television. Every person that worked there. It was midnight, and we were all in the plant.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming
and
down.
After the landing, I remember, this is kind of sentimental for me, but after the landing, and it was all over, it was probably 2 o'clock in the morning, well, when I looked up at the moon, I said, there he is. So, and that was, like I said, that was an emotional time. But, it was proof that we did it right.
John hasn't seen his former boss, Homer Ream, since their spacesuit days. So I've taken the opportunity to get them together when I meet Homer to talk about his experiences working on the Apollo program.
How did you feel when that moment came when Buzz and Neil stepped out of the spacecraft?
We saw what this was. I mean, this is the world looking at ILC's suit. And the thing that was difficult is that Apollo 11 was the systems test. The suit had been run through durability testing here at in our laboratories. We were confident of its durability. The systems test was Apollo 11, and the only problem was it was real and it was on the moon. And I just couldn't wait for it to get over. It all worked out pretty good, except they got a hit on the timeline, and Buzz Aldrin, being a daredevil as he is, he decides to reinvent some more stuff, and he's jumping around out there, and I'm thinking, get that idiot back inside. I mean, this is over. Declare it a success and get back in that limb, you know, and he's out there doing some more stuff. He was just caught up in the moment, but it all worked out okay.
Former crew systems engineers Joe McMahon and Larry Bell vividly remember what it was like to work alongside Grandpa. My discovery of an archive clip of him from an old BBC documentary about NASA, coupled with Joe and Larry's stories, gives me my first insight into what Grandpa was like to have around the office.
Matthew Radnofsky, spacesuit designer.
We have to define how he's going outside. In the event that the man were to go outside on a completely self-contained portable life support system, then some changes would have to be made.
You have to have a pack on his back.
We'd have to have a pack on his back, and the pack would have to be contain devices, chemicals, for instance.
Tell me what it was like to work with Matt Radnofsky, with my grandpa. Was he...
Matt?
Yeah, tell me a little bit about him.
Yeah. He was a character, and let me start there. Really interesting. We sometimes referred to him as the Mad Russian just because he'd get a little upset somebody didn't do what he wanted or do it as well. I was telling you earlier, he had this piece of 4x4 wood laying on his desk and a big survival machete. If he got upset with something, he'd start chopping on that block. People downstairs would call him up and says, "Would you knock it off, man? I can't hear down here." I had an experience in the same Gemini program when the crewmen complained that their communications system would slide around, and in the helmet they couldn't get to it to adjust it. And I was having a meeting in my office about how we were going to fix that, and he walks in and said, "What you need is I don't know what the number was, like a PJ7. What's that?" "Well, it's a British communications cap." He knew about these British flying caps because he'd been over there in the war and had flown with them and knew what it was. We took it apart and used it as a pattern to make what was referred to later as the Snoopy cap, because it had the brown ears, white spandex down the middle, so it kind of looked like a Snoopy dog from the cartoon, and referred to in the Apollo program as a Snoopy cap. But he was the one that got that in and started telling us that's what we needed.
Tell me what it was like at the time then to be working in crew systems. What was Grandpa like?
When Matt walked into a room, he totally filled it. He was single-minded, he was totally focused, and anybody around, no matter who you worked for by the organization chart, if Matt had a job to do, you worked for Matt. And one thing about him, he could break into the most beatific smile. He had the greatest smile I ever saw. It was like the sun coming out from behind a cloud. It was unbelievable. He would change from this totally focused, driven guy. Almost something would strike him, and his voice would soften, and he'd have this smile. So he was a volatile guy. He was a genius. He was a genius, and I don't think his contributions will ever be fully appreciated.
The stars of the space race, of course, were the astronauts, and the American public breathlessly followed every detail of their glamorous lifestyles. But the glare of the media spotlight often obscured the dangers of traveling into space, and the crucial partnership between the men who built the suits and the ones who wore them. Astronaut Jim Lovell knows better than anybody what it was like to trust the crew systems team with his life. While he shows me around an exhibition of artifacts from his 3 flights into space, he tells me how he and his crew brought his most famous mission, Apollo 13, back from the brink of disaster, thanks in part to the ingenuity of the NASA engineers on the ground.
One of our big crises was the fact that the 3 people had to live in the lunar module because the command module was dead, and the lunar module environmental system had only a couple of canisters to remove the carbon dioxide because the lunar module was designed only to be powered up once we're in lunar orbit, and it was designed to last only 2 days for only 2 people. And of course, when the explosion occurred, it was at least a 4-day flight, and there were 3 people, and consequently the canisters to remove the carbon dioxide were becoming saturated. And therefore, we had to go into the dead command module and get the canisters from that environmental system to try to see if we could, what we call jury rig, those canisters to work in the lunar module system. Unfortunately, the canisters in the command module were square. The ones that were used in the lunar module were round, and we did it with duct tape and a piece of plastic, cardboard cover from a flight manual, and an old sock. And that's how we got that thing into the environmental system of the lunar module so that it would remove the carbon dioxide, which was a perfect example of the ingenuity of the people of cruise systems. Because cruise systems had done that, people working together to figure out how that had to be done.
There are only 8 human beings still alive who have set foot on the moon, so it's an incredible privilege to get to meet one of them, Charlie Duke, lunar module pilot to Apollo 16. He spent more than 20 hours on the lunar surface with his fellow astronaut John Young.
Put us in your boots, as it were, when you're walking on the moon. Can you feel, for example, the texture of the surface that you're walking on? Can you feel any heat, or do you really feel very isolated?
Well, once you got outside, you couldn't feel the texture. In fact, I don't even recall me sinking in, but when you turned around, you saw your footprints you left. Around our landing site, probably an inch, maybe 2 inches depression. But with a moon boot on and a suit boot, you could not feel the texture. It was not like walking on the beach barefooted. The worry in the spacesuit on the moon is heat stroke, body heat. And you have to eliminate that body heat through our liquid cool garment that we had. And that worked really good. And so we had minimum cooling, intermediate cooling, and maximum cooling. When you were riding in the rover, intermediate cooling was too cold. It was like freezing in the suit. So you had to turn back to minimum. But when you got out and you started working, you had to go back to the medium setting. I felt secure, never had a fearful thought except once, and when I fell over backwards. Towards the end of our stay on the moon, and we were excited. We'd done a good job and accomplished everything except for one experiment. And so John and I were going to do the Moon Olympics, and the broad jump and the high jump. So John said, well, we're running behind Houston, and we were going to do the Moon Olympics. So he starts to bounce. And so I start to bounce. And then I gave a big jump. And when I did, unfortunately, I straightened up. And my center of gravity went backwards, and you can see me on TV just going over backwards like that. It's very scary because if I land, the backpack breaks, I'm done for. I got embarrassed because the TV camera was pointed right at me, and so they'd seen this stupid high jump. They were very upset, by the way. So that ended the Moon Olympics. They said, no more of that, get back in, guys. And so John parked the rover, I climbed in, and that was the end of our stay.
Being one of, I think, just a dozen people to ever have the chance to stand on the moon and look at the Earth, did that change your perspective of life on Earth?
Where we stood on the moon, the Earth was directly overhead. And my first thought when we first got there was, we're a long way from home. The Earth is just out there, and it's you cover it over with your hand. And those views of Earth hung up in the blackness of space. No borders, no countries, no continents. And then you do have some time to reflect.
What the engineers designing the spacesuit maybe didn't realise was that they were also creating a cultural icon. Today, the image of the Apollo astronaut has become instantly recognisable the world over. Like me, author, NASA consultant and spaceflight historian Amy Title wasn't even born yet during the Apollo project. but she's captured a 21st century audience's attention with her popular YouTube videos that explore aspects of what she calls vintage space.
That's what we're looking at today on Vintage Space.
I want to get Amy's take on why space is still such a big part of the public imagination, and why the spacesuit is found everywhere, from advertising to even fancy dress.
Can we also take a moment to appreciate that you hand embroidered your name?
I did. Yeah, I definitely did.
Title.
Oh my god, this is so cute. So I'm gonna dress Caroline up in some fun space suits here.
You can just go oh wow.
The space program has had a massive impact on modern culture, and it is exactly that, sort of the prevalence of the image of the astronaut that you see everywhere, affiliated with anything. It's sort of become the one thing, like everyone recognizes an astronaut in a big bulky spacesuit, usually the Apollo era white one, and everyone recognizes a rocket. But somehow those two things, and really mainly the suit, because it's that human link, we can see ourselves in a suit, right? You can put that on and you can sort of be the astronaut.
But what I want to do now is get inside a real spacesuit and feel for myself what it's actually like. There's an independent company in New York called Final Frontier Design. It's run by American Ted Southern and his Russian colleague Nikolai Moiseev. They're creating a suit that shares some technology with the current Russian suit, the Sokol suit, which is used by astronauts traveling to the International Space Station. Canadian astronaut Commander Chris Hadfield wore the Sokol suit during his final trip into space, where he became famous for his singing on board the International Space Station. He shows me around a Sokol suit like the one he flew in. I'm a bit nervous about being completely enclosed inside a pressure suit, so I want to know from his perspective what a spacesuit is actually like to wear.
The Russian suit is very, very elegantly simple, very purpose designed. The suit that I wore on the shuttle, much more robust, because you have to actually be able to jump out and come down under a parachute in it, so it has to be a little more rugged suit than the Russian suit. But they both do their job well. I wouldn't wear either of them recreationally. They are uncomfortable, hot, rubber, non-compliant garments to wear. So it's not too much different, say, to putting on a big heavy wetsuit and a scuba tank and a snorkel and fins and mask. You know, that's an ungainly thing to be wearing, and you wouldn't want to be wearing it walking around right here. But once you go into the water, it feels different but natural, and it allows you to spend an hour underwater that otherwise would be completely denied to you. So there's sort of that girding your loins feeling of putting all this stuff on so that then you can go do battle with something that otherwise would defeat you.
At last, the time has come to try out the Final Frontier suit. This is one of the key moments in this journey for me into understanding what it feels like, because you can look at it laid out on a table, the spacesuit, and touch the material as many times as you like. But when you're in it and all your body is covered from head to toe, and there's a visor in front of you, I think that is the spacesuit experience, and the moment when you can understand what people like my grandfather were working towards creating. I feel like a little kid. I'm like, I'm just like Chris Hadfield. The team put me through a series of physical challenges, some of which I'd probably struggle with at the best of times. I'm beginning to understand the engineering challenge involved in making a suit of fabric that enables a person to walk on the moon, especially given the technology of the 1960s. Looking back at everything that was required to make these suits, Nicolas de Monchaux was right when he said that Grandpa was a ringmaster for all the different engineering egos that poured themselves into that effort. It takes a big personality to be able to thrive in that environment. I think he sounds like a bit of a mentalist sometimes, and I like that because it makes me feel a bit, you know what, that makes me feel closer to him, realizing that actually he could be kind of a pain in the ass, and that he was a bit weird sometimes, and that he would call people in the middle of the night because he was really excited and wanted to talk about it right now. And I love that, because that's sort of the person I am a bit as well. And that's what makes me feel closer to him. Not realizing that I want someone to tell me that he was actually really irritating sometimes, because I'm really irritating sometimes, and that makes me feel closer to him. Matt Radnofsky's daughter, my Auntie Barbara, still lives in Houston, Texas. As part of the research for this film, she's been looking through old paperwork and photographs from that time. Grandpa died when he was 68 years old, just 3 years after I was born in the UK. He only saw me twice and wanted to visit again, but his health finally failed him. I wish I could have interviewed him for this film.
What you don't know is that your effort to do this, your effort, Caroline, to find out about your grandfather is exactly the way Matt would act and would hope and dream that you would act, because we spoke a lot the weeks before he died, and he knew that he was not well, and he was 68, and he felt his time was coming. He really wanted a heart transplant but couldn't qualify. And so he was planning a trip with me to see you when he died. And your actions in learning about him is just what he'd want. That was his great love. And you're the youngest. And he really wanted you to know about him. He really wanted to visit you. There it is.
As I come close to the end of my journey of discovery about Grandpa and the spacesuit, I've got a new understanding and respect for the work of NASA and all those who played their part in putting man on the moon. For me and my family, we have one enduring personal legacy to remember Grandpa by, an icon of the 20th century. This is the Apollo suit. This is pretty much the real deal. I mean, this is the real deal. This is what my grandfather and his colleagues designed, what ILC Dover made, and what the crew of Apollo wore to walk on the moon. In many ways, this was Grandpa's most famous legacy. This was his triumph. And the man who wore this came back to Earth safely. And that was because of NASA, Crew Systems, ILC Dover, and Grandpa.
One small step for man, one giant leap for man.